A black boy from a broke Mississippi town walked onto a national stage. The judges laughed before he sang a single note. Then he opened his mouth. Every single one of them stood up. This is the story of Marcus Cole. Subscribe so you don't miss what happened next. There is a moment that happens before the music starts, and nobody talks about that moment. They talk about the standing ovation. They talk about the judges and the tears and the 10 million people watching from home. But nobody talks about what happened before any of that. The moment a 19-year-old boy from Clarksdale, Mississippi, stood at the edge of a stage in Nashville, Tennessee, holding a crumpled piece of paper in his back pocket, and tried to remember how to breathe like a person who wasn't about to fall apart. His name was Marcus Cole. And before you understand what happened on that stage, you need to understand where Marcus Cole came from. Because a voice like his doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a place most people would never think to look. Clarksdale sits in the Mississippi Delta like something the rest of the country forgot to come back for. The roads crack in the summer heat and don't get fixed until the following year, sometimes the year after that. The nearest grocery store with fresh produce was a 25-minute drive from the neighborhood where Marcus lived with his grandmother, a woman named Ruth Cole, Mama Ruth, as everyone in the Mount Calvary Baptist congregation called her. In a house where the heating worked reliably in 2 rooms and the kitchen window had been sealed shut with a folded dish towel and electrical tape since the previous November. The median household income in their part of Clarksdale was $20,000 a year. Marcus knew this not because anyone told him, but because he was the one who balanced the household budget on the back of an envelope every month, moving numbers around until they almost added up. Mama Ruth was 70 years old, the choir director at Mount Calvary Baptist for the better part of 4 decades, a woman with type 2 diabetes and failing vision in her left eye. And she walked 3 miles to church every Sunday without complaint, the same way she did everything, quietly, completely, as though the difficulty of a thing was simply not relevant information. Marcus walked with her. He had been walking with her every Sunday since he was old enough to keep pace. And somewhere around the time he turned 17, he noticed that she was gripping his arm a little tighter on the uphill stretches, that her breathing came a little heavier after the 2nd mile. He never said anything about it. He just slowed down and pretended that was his natural speed, which is the kind of thing you learn to do when you love someone and you understand that calling attention to their weakness is its own kind of cruelty. His father had been in prison since Marcus was 3. What Marcus didn't tell anyone, not his friends, not his teachers, not even Mama Ruth, as though keeping it unspoken might somehow make it less real, was that his mother was serving time too. Not for violence, for a drug possession charge that a volunteer attorney had described, in a low voice in a courthouse hallway, as a sentence that would not have been handed down to a white woman with money for a real lawyer. The system had taken both of his parents before he was old enough to understand what a system was. Mama Ruth had raised him from the age of 3 and had never once made him feel like a burden, which is the hardest thing a person can do, and the thing Marcus was most grateful for, even on the days he didn't know how to say it. In the top drawer of his desk, folded into quarters, was a rejection letter from the Harrington School of Music, one of the most respected music conservatories in the South. Marcus had passed the artistic audition. His scores had been excellent, but the scholarship committee, after reviewing his family background, had withdrawn the offer with language so carefully neutral it could have meant anything. Circumstances that do not align with the stability required for our academic environment. It was not about his talent. It was about whose name appeared in a criminal database when they searched his family. Marcus had not thrown the letter away. He had not cried over it, or at least not where anyone could see him. He had folded it, tucked it into his back pocket, and carried it with him, like a wound he hadn't figured out how to heal yet. He would be carrying it the night everything changed. Marcus had a speaking voice that carried more of his singing range than most people knew was possible. Not the voice of a woman, but not the voice most people expected from a boy his age either. The kind of voice that made strangers do a second take in checkout lines and on buses, that some people found beautiful before they decided it made them uncomfortable. It was not the voice of someone who sounded like what they thought a singer should sound like. That was part of the problem. By the time he was in middle school, the jokes had become routine. Girl voice. Broken. Somebody fix that. When he was 15, a teacher interrupted his presentation in front of the whole class and said, in a voice that was trying to sound helpful, that he needed to project more. Marcus understood then that the teacher could hear him perfectly well. She simply didn't want to hear him like that. He stopped raising his hand after that. He sat in the back of every classroom and let his grades do the speaking instead. And his teachers wrote the same phrase on every report card: Marcus needs to participate more, without once asking themselves why a boy who had perfect scores on every written assignment had decided it was safer to be invisible. What nobody knew was what Marcus did every afternoon after his shift at the grocery store on Cypress Street, 10 minutes from his house, on a block that the city had more or less stopped maintaining, stood the old New Canaan Baptist Church, shuttered since 2015, when the congregation had been forced to dissolve because they could no longer afford the property taxes. The roof was rusted along the eaves. One of the side windows had a crack running from corner to corner and a lower pane that was missing entirely. But the interior, the old oak floorboards, and the low curved ceiling that had been shaped by a craftsman who understood something about sound, created a natural resonance that no recording studio could manufacture with money. Marcus had found the place at 14, ducking through the broken window to escape a group of boys who thought his voice was funny. He sat down in the first pew, which was thick with dust and smelled of wood and old hymnal paper, and he sang. The church held his voice in a way that nothing else ever had. He went back the next day, and the day after that. For 5 years, every afternoon, every weekend, through summer heat and winter cold, Marcus Cole came to the abandoned church and sang the hymns that Mama Ruth had spent a lifetime teaching her choir, sang classical pieces he downloaded from the library's digital archive, let his voice go places he had trained himself never to let it go in front of another human being. What he had, though he didn't have the vocabulary for it, was a natural countertenor, a male voice that sits in the female alto and soprano range, rare enough that music historians tend to describe it in the language of anomaly. It was the kind of voice that built careers, that filled concert halls, that made listeners feel they were in the presence of something they couldn't fully explain. Marcus had never had a single lesson. Everything he knew came from listening to Mama Ruth's conduct, and from 5 years of singing alone in the dark to no one. What Marcus did not know, what he had no way of knowing, was that the old New Canaan church was the last place his grandfather had ever sung. Deacon Samuel Cole had been the choir director at New Canaan before moving his ministry to Mount Calvary, where Mama Ruth would later take over the choir after his death. He had died on the pulpit in 1998 during a Sunday service, mid-song, his heart stopping so quietly that the choir kept singing for 2 full bars before they understood what had happened. Mama Ruth had been there. She had watched it happen. She had never spoken of it to Marcus, not once in 19 years, for reasons she kept close and private. And Mama Ruth knew about the abandoned church. She had known almost from the beginning. Every time she walked home from Mount Calvary by the route that cut past New Canaan, which she did more often than the distance strictly required, she could hear her grandson's voice filtering out through the broken window. And she would stop on the sidewalk and listen for a while before continuing home. She said nothing. She waited. She was the woman who had lived long enough to understand that some doors can only be opened from the inside. It was a Sunday in March when Mama Ruth's legs gave out. She was midway through Precious Lord, Take My Hand, the hymn Thomas Dorothy had written in 1932 after his wife died in childbirth, and his grief had become so large he didn't know what else to do with it, except turn it into music, when her knees simply stopped cooperating. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. She didn't cry out. Her body just made a quiet decision to stop holding her up, and she began to go down, and Marcus was out of the second pew and catching her before she reached the floor. The choir stopped. The congregation froze in that particular stillness that descends on a room when something has gone wrong, but nobody yet knows how wrong. Someone near the back of the church was already dialing 911, and Marcus, kneeling on the hardwood floor with his grandmother's weight against his chest, did something he had never done in front of another human being in his life. He started to sing. He picked up exactly where Mama Ruth had left off, holding her, his voice filling the old wooden church from floor to ceiling, a countertenor ringing off the rafters with a clarity that nobody in that room had any frame of reference for. He didn't decide to do it. He would not have been able to explain it afterward. It was instinct, or terror, or love, or all three happening simultaneously in a place too deep for decisions. Reverend Thomas was standing at the back of the church. He was a careful man, measured in speech and deliberate in action, not given to dramatic statements. When the paramedics had come and gone, and Mama Ruth had been taken to Mercy General, she was stable, low blood pressure. They said, "Get some rest." He found Marcus sitting alone in the front pew and said, "How long have you been hiding that?" Marcus did not answer. Reverend Thomas did not push. But he had already started thinking. What nobody in the congregation knew was that Reverend Thomas had not acted on impulse when he made his next move. He had been watching Voices of America, the nationally televised singing competition, now in its 10th season, for 3 months, studying the format, researching what kinds of voices tended to advance, reaching out through an old church network to a former congregation member who now worked in Nashville. That man's name was Jerome Ellis, and he was the lead audio engineer for the show. And when Reverend Thomas had asked him quietly whether the program was genuinely looking for undiscovered talent or just polished product, Jerome had said, without much elaboration, in the way of a man who had seen both kinds, that the show could still surprise you if the voice was real enough. Jerome did not know, when he said that he had just opened a door he would spend the rest of the season deciding what to do about. 2 weeks after Mama Ruth's collapse, Reverend Thomas called Marcus into his office and told him he had registered him for Voices of America. The entry fee, $100 from the church's discretionary fund, was already paid. Marcus said no. He said no 5 times in 5 different ways, each one more certain than the last. Reverend Thomas waited him out and then said, "Mama Ruth cannot lead that choir much longer. You know it, and I know it. If you don't let somebody hear what God put in you, it's going to die in that old church with the broken window." Marcus had no response to that. He left the office without agreeing to anything, and then he went home and packed one good shirt into a grocery bag. He told Mama Ruth he had a job interview. He had practiced the lie carefully, keeping it specific enough to be convincing. A warehouse position in Memphis, a company that did inventory for distribution centers, decent hourly rate, and when he said it, she looked at him for a moment that lasted about 1 second longer than a normal look, the kind of pause that could mean nothing, or could mean she was deciding not to say something. Then she nodded and told him to be careful on the roads. He took the Greyhound out of Clarksdale at 6 in the morning, the bus half empty, the windows fogged with November cold, and he sat in the window seat with the rejection letter from Harrington folded in his back pocket and his good shirt in the grocery bag between his feet. He didn't know why he brought the letter. He hadn't made a conscious decision to bring it. It had been in his pocket so long that leaving it behind felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. The bus had been on the road for about 2 hours, somewhere on the interstate south of Memphis, when his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. The area code was Mississippi. He looked at it for a moment before opening it, and when he read it, he stayed very still. "Son, I heard from Reverend Thomas. You're going to sing somewhere. He wrote to me last week. He still sends letters to the facility. Has done it for years. I can watch TV in here. Sing well. Mama." His mother was serving her sentence at the Mississippi Women's Correctional Facility in Pearl. He hadn't spoken to her in 3 years. Not because he didn't want to, or not only because of that, but because the wanting and the not knowing what to say had become so tangled together over time that silence had started to feel like the only honest option. He read the message twice. He set the phone face down on his knee. He looked out the window at the flat brown fields of the Delta, passing in the gray morning light, and felt something he didn't have a name for. Not anger, not grief, not exactly, just the pressure behind his sternum that he breathed through slowly until it settled into something he could carry. He did not text back. He would think about that for a long time afterward. What Marcus did not know, sitting on that Greyhound with his grocery bag and his folded letter and his unanswered text, was that Mama Ruth was not in Clarksdale. She had not been in Clarksdale since the previous Tuesday. The women of Mount Calvary, the Deaconess Board, the choir mothers, the Wednesday afternoon Bible study group had quietly passed the hat over the course of a week, collecting $300 in small bills and loose change from people who did not have much to give but gave it anyway. They had bought Mama Ruth a bus ticket to Nashville and arranged for her to stay with a family from the congregation who had moved there 4 years ago. She had watched Voices of America's rehearsal day from the back of the studio audience with her wide-brimmed church hat pulled low, and she planned to stay for everything. Marcus thought he had left her behind. He had not left her behind. The production facility in Nashville was the kind of place that announced its own importance the moment you walked through the door: glass walls, LED panels that stretched from floor to ceiling, a lobby with the kind of lighting designed to make everything look like it was already on television. Marcus arrived with his grocery bag and found a corner backstage where he could sit without being in anyone's way. The other contestants moved through the space with the ease of people who had been preparing for exactly this their entire lives: matching luggage, parents with printed schedules, vocal coaches running warm-up exercises in the hallways. One girl who had an actual publicist standing next to her taking notes on a phone. Marcus watched all of this from his corner and said nothing. Connor Walsh walked past without looking at him. Connor was 20 years old, from Nashville itself, the kind of person for whom the word polished had been invented, not because he wasn't talented, because he genuinely was, but because his talent had been shaped by a system that knew exactly what it wanted to produce and had been producing it for years. His vocal coach had worked with him since he was 12. That coach's name was a detail Connor had never thought much about. A man named Gary Sutton, who had been connected to the show's head judge, Victor Hale, for longer than the show had been on the air. Connor knew this, in the peripheral way. You know things that have always operated in your favor. You're aware of the fact without ever having needed to examine it. Victor Hale shook Marcus's hand during the pre-show meet and greet with a smile so wide it looked like effort. He glanced at the registration form, Clarksdale, Mississippi, no formal training, and the smile stayed exactly where it was, which was the tell that almost nobody noticed about Victor Hale. His smile widened when he felt threatened. When he was genuinely relaxed, he barely smiled at all. He said, "Well, coming all the way from Clarksdale, this ought to be quite an experience for you." It sounded like encouragement. It was a door being quietly closed. What Hale did not say, what he understood in the 4 seconds it took him to register Marcus's speaking voice and cross-reference it against 30 years of working in the industry, was that he recognized the voice type immediately. He had encountered 3 natural countertenors in 3 decades of A&R work. All 3 had created problems for him, not because they lacked ability, but because their sound was too singular, too difficult to package, too resistant to the systems he had spent his career building. He had managed that problem before. He would manage it again. Marcus went back to his corner. He sat on his grocery bag. In the backstage bathroom, 20 minutes before his group was called, he stood over the sink with his hands braced on the porcelain and tried to breathe in counts the way Mama Ruth had taught the choir to count measures. He called her. She picked up on the second ring, cheerful, entirely unsuspecting, and asked if he was having fun. He almost told her everything. The words were right there, arranged and ready. Instead, he said he was fine, said he loved her, listened to her tell him she loved him more, and hung up. Then he picked the Harrington letter up off the wet tile floor where it had slipped from his pocket, tucked it back where it belonged, washed his face, and walked toward the stage because the alternative was staying in the bathroom, and he had not ridden a Greyhound 6 hours to stay in a bathroom. The stage lights hit him, and he looked exactly like what he was. The youngest competitor that night, the leanest, the one who had arrived in a grocery bag instead of a rolling suitcase. And when he leaned into the microphone to introduce himself, his speaking voice spread through the auditorium in the way that unusual things sometimes do in front of people who have already made up their minds. It registered and was immediately filed away as something not worth examining, because the decision about him had already been made before he opened his mouth. The murmur that went through the room was not cruel exactly, but it was the crowd making a collective judgment based on what they saw. The grocery bag, the youth, the absence of everything that usually signals arrival. The judgment was not in his favor. Someone in the 4th row whispered something that the boom mic caught, and that would later be subtitled on the viral video. Victor Hale tilted his head with the wide smile. "You came all the way from Clarksdale with that voice? I respect the confidence. But this is a national stage, not a Sunday church service." The judge on his left covered her mouth. Simone Grant, 2 Grammys, gospel roots, a childhood in Tupelo that had more in common with Marcus's childhood than she had thought about in years, let out a short breath of laughter. It lasted 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, without warning or invitation, a memory came back to her that she had not summoned. She was 19 years old and standing on a stage not entirely unlike this one, and a judge had looked at her and said, with a smile that looked just like helpfulness, "You'll be doing gospel, I assume." The assumption that a black girl from Mississippi couldn't be anything else. She had spent the next 30 years proving that assumption wrong, and 2 seconds ago, she had been that judge. She understood this before the laughter was fully out of her mouth, and the understanding hit her somewhere below the sternum and stayed there. She pressed her hand flat against the table and said nothing. Marcus nodded to the pianist. The song was "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," the hymn Mama Ruth had been conducting when her legs gave out. He did not choose it for strategic reasons. He chose it because it was the only song that made him forget there were people in the room. The first 4 bars were a cappella. His voice was quiet, high, fragile, exactly what the crowd had expected it to be, exactly what Hale was already preparing to dismiss. Then, something changed on the 5th bar. Not volume, not technique, color. The countertenor opened up from somewhere underneath everything, from the old oak floors of the abandoned church, from 5 years of singing to no one, and it did not announce itself or build toward itself. It simply arrived, the way warmth arrives in a room when you open a door you didn't know was there. By the end of the first verse, the auditorium was completely silent. Not polite silence. The silence of 3,000 people who had simultaneously understood that they were in the presence of something they were not going to be able to explain to anyone who wasn't in the room. He held the high BB for 10 seconds, pianissimo, controlled so precisely the note seemed to breathe on its own. On the final line, his voice cracked. Not a technical failure, an emotional one. The kind of crack that carries everything a person has been holding. The bus, the bathroom floor, the letter in his pocket, the grandmother who didn't know he was here. He recovered instantly. The crack had lasted less than a second. It was the most honest thing anyone in that room had ever heard. 5 seconds of absolute silence. Then the room came apart. Simone Grant stood first, removing her glasses, pressing her fingers against her closed eyes. Victor Hale's body stood up before his mind could intervene. A physical response, the kind that bypasses intention, the way you stand for an anthem before you've decided to. He stood for 5 seconds. Then he sat back down. Too quickly, the awkwardness of the correction, worse than if he'd simply remained standing. The camera caught it. Social media would replay those 5 seconds 15 million times before morning. Victor Hale scored Marcus a 7.5. The other judges gave 9.5, 9.8, and 9.7. The audience booed. A genuine, sustained boo. The first time in 10 seasons that a judge had been booed on that stage. And Hale absorbed it with the composure of a man who had been the most powerful person in every room he'd entered for 30 years and had no intention of stopping now. He leaned into his microphone and said that he was judging the complete package, technique, stage presence, interpretive range, and that standing still and singing a hymn was a church recital, not a competition performance, and that he was giving Marcus room to grow. It sounded reasonable. It was the most precisely calibrated act of diminishment the audience had ever watched, made worse by the fact that the man delivering it had been on his feet 30 seconds earlier. That night, Hale made 2 moves that he did not announce and did not need to. The first was structural. As executive producer, he proposed that round 2 include a versatility segment, each finalist assigned a genre outside their comfort zone. He called it a format innovation, fresh and educational, great for ratings. The production team approved it unanimously, because when the executive producer suggests something, it doesn't feel like a suggestion. Every genre assignment was drawn randomly from a list, except one. Hale personally assigned Marcus the contemporary R&B ballad category. Low register, narrow melodic range, acoustically hostile to a countertenor voice, a trap built out of sheet music. The second move was quieter. He stopped by the audio booth and mentioned to the sound supervisor, in the conversational tone of someone sharing a professional observation, that Marcus's upper register was coming in a little sharp on the broadcast mix and might benefit from pulling back the high-end EQ to avoid blowing out home speakers. It was technically plausible. Jerome Ellis, the show's lead engineer, 35 years old, 2 kids, and this was the best job he had ever had, pulled up the broadcast specs after Hale left, and sat with them for a long time. The upper register hadn't clipped. He checked it himself during round 1. The adjustment would make Marcus's countertenor sound thinner on air, not ruined, just subtly diminished. The kind of thing a viewer at home might register, as he didn't sound as good this time without understanding why. Jerome opened a new file on his workstation. He saved the before and after EQ settings to a USB drive. He put the drive in his locker. Then he made the adjustment as instructed, because he had rent due and 2 children in school, and the order had come from the executive producer's office. Connor Walsh, walking back to his room that night, heard something through the wall of the hallway, a voice coming from behind the closed door of Marcus's room, low and strained, working through a melody that didn't fit it. Connor stopped. He listened. He did something then that he would later have to reckon with. He recorded 15 seconds of audio on his phone and sent it to Raymond Park, an independent producer he knew in Nashville, with a message that said only, "Listen to this guy. He's competing here right now." Connor didn't tell Marcus. Marcus received his genre assignment and sat with it on the edge of his bed in the cheapest room the show's contestant housing offered. He tried to sing the assigned R&B ballad in his natural voice and sounded, as he would think of it later, like a kid doing karaoke at someone's birthday party. He called Reverend Thomas. The Reverend told him to pray about it, and they both knew that wasn't quite enough. Marcus hung up and sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the wall for a while. Then he reached into his back pocket and took out the letter from Harrington. He had carried it so long that the paper had gone soft at the folds. He looked at the front, the letterhead, the careful, neutral language, the signatures at the bottom for a moment. Then, for the first time since the day it arrived, he turned it over. He took the pencil from the nightstand drawer and began to write. Not words, notes. He took the chord progression from the assigned pop ballad and rebuilt the vocal line from the ground up, keeping the verses low enough that his voice could manage them, reworking the chorus into a register where his countertenor could actually live, transforming a forgettable radio song into something that sounded like gospel and sounded like grief and sounded, above all, like something that had never existed before. Someone made it up in a cheap hotel room in Nashville with a pencil and a piece of paper. He practiced in the bathroom, with the shower running so his roommates wouldn't hear. 1 floor below, the young man working the overnight desk paused in the middle of wiping down the counter and looked up at the ceiling. He stood there for a moment before going back to work, moving just a little more slowly than before. The letter now had 2 faces. The committee's rejection on the front, Marcus's music on the back. He hadn't planned it that way. Simone Grant was awake in her room 3 floors up, working through a decade of data on her laptop. She had pulled the scoring records from all 10 seasons of Voices of America, publicly available, never analyzed this way, and run a comparison of Hale's scores against the other judges for every performance. She was not a statistician. She didn't need to be. The pattern was blunt enough to read without specialized tools. Victor Hale scored black male contestants an average of 1.5 points lower than his fellow judges scored. The same performances, consistently, across 10 seasons, in a gap that was invisible if you looked at any single night, but impossible to deny if you looked at all of them. She drafted a report. She sent it to the network's independent review board. Then she picked up her phone and called a journalist she had known for 5 years, who covered the entertainment industry with the patience of someone who understood that some stories take time to become provable. And she said, "I have your numbers." Round 2. Marcus placed the Harrington letter on the music stand, with the penciled notes facing him. Victor Hale settled into his chair with the stillness of a man watching a mechanism he had built perform exactly as designed. The first verse was thin and low, Marcus's voice managing the assigned register, but not thriving in it, staying on pitch without anything close to glory. Hale began to write. Then the chorus arrived, and the borrowed ballad transformed in real time. The rearranged melody lifting into the countertenor range, where Marcus actually lived, gospel inflection folding into pop structure in a way that nobody had heard before because nobody had needed to make it up before. The audience didn't applaud. They breathed. A collective inhale when the note landed. A collective exhale when it resolved. The sound of 3,000 people responding with their bodies before their minds could form an opinion. Round 1 had been beauty that shocked. Round 2 was creativity that earned something harder than shock. Hale scored a 7. His remarks were smooth and professional. Creative attempt, vocal limitation workaround, room to stretch. Translation: you were supposed to fail, and you didn't. So I'm going to describe your success as a crutch. The formal complaint he filed the next morning went to the show's rules committee, 3 network executives and 2 independent producers. None of them Hale, though all of them appointed during his tenure. The vote was 3-2. Marcus could advance to the finale, but his round 2 score was reduced by half a point as a penalty for deviating from the assigned material. It was a decision made by people who were not Victor Hale, but who had learned, over years, to arrive at the conclusions he would have reached himself. Half a point dropped him from first place to third. The mathematics of the finale, with Hale's established scoring pattern, made a Marcus victory nearly impossible. His phone rang that evening. He picked up expecting her normal voice, warm, unhurried, asking if he'd eaten, and heard instead a silence that had weight to it. The silence of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has decided to set it down. She said, "I saw you on the television," Marcus started to explain. She didn't let him finish. "Marcus, I have heard you singing in the old New Canaan church every afternoon for 5 years. I used to stop on the sidewalk and listen through the broken window on my way home. The bottom dropped out of everything." She had known from nearly the beginning. She had listened from the sidewalk and said nothing, had watched him carry the secret into this house and out of it every single day, and had not said a word because she was waiting for the day he trusted himself enough, trusted the world enough to step out where someone could see him. Instead, he had gone to Nashville in secret and was still finding ways to hide. She wasn't angry, she was hurt. He went to the stairwell at the back of the venue and sat on the concrete steps and cried, not dramatically, not visibly, his shoulders shaking with no sound coming out, in exactly the way he had always done everything that mattered to him, in the dark, where no one could see. She called back the next night, and her voice had changed. The hurt had moved over to make room for something else. The voice she used when she was teaching the choir, something they needed to carry with them. She said, "Your grandfather, Deacon Samuel, died on the pulpit of that church in 1998. He was singing when his heart stopped. I was there." She paused. "You've been singing in the place where he sang for the last time. I knew you'd find it. I didn't know how long it would take." Marcus held the phone against his forehead for a while after she said goodbye. When he stood up and walked to the mirror and looked at himself, he didn't look brave or ready. He looked like a 19-year-old who had been crying and had just been given something large and heavy to carry. But his hands weren't shaking anymore. 10 million viewers, 3,000 seats, every one of them filled. Hand-lettered signs in the audience. Judge the voice, not the face. Clarksdale is watching. 10 seasons, same bias. Victor Hale saw the signs from the judge's table, and his smile was very, very wide. Connor Walsh performed first, polished, confident, a pop anthem executed with the precision of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment since childhood. The audience received it generously. Hale scored him a 9.8. In the audio booth, Jerome Ellis sat before his mixing board and looked at the EQ settings that were still adjusted the way Hale had requested. He opened the drawer and looked at the USB drive. He closed the drawer. He opened the mixing board software and reset the equalization to the settings he had established himself during round 1. The settings that were correct, that he had verified with his own equipment, that would let Marcus's countertenor come through the broadcast exactly as it sounded in that room. He folded his hands on the desk and did not touch anything else. The camera in the booth captured this. A man with his hands still, watching the stage, having already done the one thing he came here to do. Marcus walked out. No piano. He had requested it be removed. He reached into his back pocket and took out the Harrington letter. He unfolded it slowly, all the way, fully open, for the first time since the day it arrived, and placed it on the music stand with the penciled notes facing him. The camera zoomed in. 10 million people, at home, saw a wrinkled, soft creased piece of paper covered in handwritten notes. The people who had been paying attention understood immediately what they were looking at. Marcus closed his eyes. He was not in Nashville. He was in the old New Canaan church, the oak floor under his feet, the low curved ceiling above him, the broken window and the dark, and the 5 years of singing that nobody had asked for and nobody had come to hear. The first verse was a whisper, so quiet that 3,000 people leaned forward in their seats simultaneously without realizing they were doing it. The second verse rose into the countertenor register, and the voice that came out was not the same voice that had stunned the room in round one. It was deeper in some way that had nothing to do with pitch. Between round one and tonight, this person had been sabotaged and penalized and broken open by a phone call from his grandmother. The voice carried all of that, every piece of it, unpolished, unvarnished, present. He opened his eyes and looked at Victor Hale. Not with anger, not with defiance, with recognition, the clear, level look of someone who sees a person fully and accurately, without the buffer of hope or confusion, and is no longer surprised by what they see. He held the high BB for 15 seconds, pianissimo, and it did not soar. It ached. It was the sound of someone who had spent 5 years singing in the dark, who had been told in 100 quiet ways that his voice was wrong, producing the most precise and true sound a human throat is capable of making. And the heartbreak of it was that the beauty had always been there, in the dark, in the broken church, in the cold, and nobody had come to listen. On the final line, his voice broke on the word me, deliberately, openly, with full intention, and the break contained everything. 6 seconds of absolute silence. Then the room detonated. Simone Grant stood first, glasses forgotten in her hand. The other judges followed. Victor Hale rose, slowly, without resistance, the way a person rises when a sound has gone somewhere deeper than choice. And he stood and did not sit back down. His face was empty of everything he had spent 30 years maintaining. Just a man, in a room, standing for a 19-year-old boy with a crumpled piece of paper. During the final commercial break, every journalist in the building felt their phone vibrate simultaneously. A chain of internal production emails had been forwarded anonymously to 5 newsrooms. Emails that documented the genre assignment, the audio adjustment, the paper trail of a system being used against one contestant in particular. Jerome Ellis said nothing to anyone in the building that night. He had put the USB drive in a plain envelope before the finale began and left it in the mailbox of a journalist he had never met, but whose name, Simone Grant, had texted him 2 days earlier, with no explanation attached. He went home to his children. When the broadcast returned from commercial, Victor Hale's chair was empty. He had left during the break. No statement, no exit. Just an empty seat and the particular silence of something that has been in a room a long time finally being gone. The scores came in, 3 10s. Hale's score, filed by the automated system before he left, 8.5, higher than he had given Marcus in either previous round. The number of a man who understood that the journalists in the building already had everything they needed and had made a calculation about how far down he could still pull without making the number itself into evidence. Still pulling down, still not enough. Marcus won by half a point. Connor Walsh stepped to the side microphone before the results were read and said, without a script, I recorded Marcus singing in the hotel and sent it to a producer without asking him. That was wrong and I'm sorry. He paused. The producer's name is Raymond Park, and he wants Marcus to know he's interested. Not because of the clip, because of tonight. It wasn't a perfect moment. It was a 20-year-old learning to see what he'd been given and choosing to say something about it while it still cost him something. The host asked Marcus if he wanted to say anything. Marcus leaned into the microphone, the same voice that every judge on that panel had decided, before he sang a single note, was not the voice of someone worth listening to, and said 5 words, I need to call my grandma. The audience laughed, the full-body release of people who have been holding tension for hours. Someone near the back shouted that his grandma was right there. Marcus turned. Mama Ruth was standing in row 15, her wide hat tilted back, her hand raised, her eyes red. He stepped off the stage without waiting for anyone's permission and walked to her and held her, and for several seconds nobody made any sound at all. Then the applause came, slowly, then completely, then without limit. Not for the competition and not for the trophy, but for a woman who had stood on a sidewalk for 5 years, listening to her grandson sing through a broken window, and had never said a word because she was waiting for him to choose to come out. That night, his phone rang with an unfamiliar Mississippi number. The voice on the other end said a nurse had lent her the phone, that everyone in the facility had watched, that when he sang, they all stood up. Mama is proud of you, she said. He was quiet for 10 seconds. "I know, Mama," he said. Not complicated, not full of everything that word usually cost him. Just true, and said plainly, for the first time in his life, without anything in the way. Months later, Mama Ruth was in the kitchen when she heard singing from the front of the house. Not from the direction of the old New Canaan church. Not from inside. From the front steps. She walked to the screen door and looked through. Marcus was sitting on the porch in the morning light, singing Precious Lord, Take My Hand at full voice, in the open air of a Clarksdale morning, where the neighbors could hear, and the street could hear, and the whole world could hear if it wanted to. She didn't call out. She didn't interrupt. She stood behind the screen and listened. For 5 years, he had sung in the dark because he was afraid. Then he had sung on a stage in Nashville because there was nowhere left to run. But that morning, on the front steps of his grandmother's house, under the Mississippi sun, he sang because he wanted to be heard. If this story puts something in your chest that you can't quite name, hit like and subscribe so more stories like this can find the people who need them, and drop a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest and where in the world you're watching from.